Good evening. I'd like to welcome all of you here. American Public Square had its first event in Kansas City just about 8 years ago, and it was at the Kansas City Public Library. Fittingly enough that we're back, except it was at the one downtown. So I want to thank the Public Library, Kansas City Public Library. I want to thank the International Relations Commission, who is our International Relations Council, who is our partner tonight, along with the Truman Presidential Library, where we had originally planned to have this event, but that organization that no one had ever heard of until recently, the National Archives, indicated that there was a, they weren't sure whether the COVID levels were going to make it possible. And the other people I want to thank are all the people here that are members. If you're a member of American Public Square, would you just raise your hand? Okay, thank you all. And by the way, look around and the people that are not raising their hand, your job is to turn them into a member before the night's over. This program, the idea for this program began when I was in Portugal at the time of the invasion of the Ukraine by Russia. And I went and spoke to one of our sponsors for tonight, the Luso-American Foundation. And it is a foundation that but basically funds programs between the United States and Portugal. And I spoke with the president there of the foundation, and I said it would be wonderful if we have a program on what the role of the United States should be in the world. Would you be willing to send us a great diplomat from Portugal? And fortunately, it also happened to be someone who was a friend of mine, so fortunately he's here tonight, and you'll hear more about him in a minute. I want to underscore that what we at American Public Square, what we're really dedicated to is creating conversations that will allow us to listen to people with whom we disagree. And also to remember that when you find people that have profound disagreements with you, that this is their country too. And we hope that we all can treat each other in a way that can recognize that. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the Executive Director of American Public Square, Ms. Claire Bishop.
Thanks, Alan. Great to see you all here tonight. Thank you so much for being here. As Alan mentioned, Claire Bishop, and as Executive Director of APS, it's my job tonight to share with you some of the civility tools that we employ in our programs to help ensure that our conversations are civil, substantive, and above all, fact-based. So I'm going to share a little bit more with you in just a moment, but first, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, without whose support tonight would not be possible. So thanks goes to FLAD, the Luso-American Development Foundation, Ogletree Deacons, the Hall Family Foundation, the Harry S. Truman Library and Museum, Jerry White and Cyprian Simkowitz, Herb and Bonnie Bookbinder, Marnie and John Sherman, the Seidler Family Foundation, the Kansas City Public Library, where we are enjoying this lovely program tonight, and of course our partners, the International Relations Council, with whom we are co-producing this event tonight. So, as mentioned, APS employs several tools to guide our discussion. We're pleased to provide you access to a digital fact sheet about tonight's topic. This fact sheet is substantive and takes a good deal of time to prepare. It's important because it enables all of our panelists, who most certainly will differ in their viewpoints, an important opportunity to agree on a basic set of facts before the conversation begins. If you are here in person, you should have seen a QR code that you can use to access this content. We'll make sure that that's available as well on signage. And if you are logging in virtually, a link is being dropped into the chat now, so you can use that link to access that digital content. In addition to our fact sheet, we do have a live fact checker. We encourage our audience to request fact checks and ask questions. We have a special way that we do questions and fact checks. So if you're attending tonight's program in person and you have a question or a fact check, you may complete a Q&A or fact check card. And I meant to bring one up with me, but they were being handed out up at the front along with pens. If you need one and don't have one, just give your hand a raise. Thank you. I see Bob's in the audience with one there. Go ahead and write your question down, raise it up, and we'll have a volunteer in an APS shirt come by and grab that. And they'll share that with our fact checker and our roving reporter. And by the way, our roving reporter tonight here, Stephen Seigman, Director of Classical KC and Chief of Broadcast Operations at KCUR. He's going to do a great job tonight. And our fact checker is Liam Ridley, a senior library technician. He's over here off to the side at the fact checking station. Liam is a senior library technician with the Kansas City Public Library, so we thank him for making his services available tonight. This is a really great part of the APS style of program. We ask that other than opening and closing, you do not clap during the program. This helps to ensure that perspectives are not swayed one way or another during the conversation. And then lastly, a few of you in the audience have possession of an APS civility bell. If you have one of those, give it a testing now if you don't mind. Make sure they're working. Okay, fantastic. You have an important job tonight. If you sense the conversation getting heated or moving toward incivility, give that bell a ring and don't be shy. That is a sign to everyone present that it is time to pause, take a deep breath, and cool down for a moment before the discussion continues. With that, I'd like to hand the mic over to our moderator for this evening's event, Matthew Hughes, Executive Director of the International Relations Council. Over to you, Matthew.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much. It's great to see you. As Claire said, my name is Matthew Hughes, the Executive Director of the International Relations Council in Kansas City. We are delighted to be co-presenting this program with American Public Square, and would like to thank Ambassador Katz and Claire and their team at APS for making this program possible. If you are an IRC member, would you raise your hand, please? It's good to see you. Thank you so much. The International Relations Council is a Kansas City organization that talks about what's going on around the world, how it connects to our community. Our first speaker was Eleanor Roosevelt in January of 1955, and since then we've been bringing in journalists, professors, diplomats to share their expertise, and that lineage continues today. So we welcome our esteemed guests. Disruption from COVID-19, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, significant leadership turnovers, and ongoing economic turbulence have indeed created historic challenges that drive concerns about the stability, security, and strength of the global community. And before that, there were already signs of a shifting global power balance developing in key corners of the world, China growing its role in global infrastructure projects. Russia was vying for increased power in key neighboring regions. There were domestic fires in the US impacting its focus on defense, diplomatic, and development efforts abroad. There are significant questions that leaders around the world are facing today, and we have with us one of the best panels that's going to help us to dive into these issues and understand what ought to be the US's role in the world today. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce them to you. To my left is Ambassador Francisco Seixas da Costa. Ambassador da Costa is a retired diplomat working at present in the private sector as a consultant and director of several companies. He works as a professor at the Universidade Autónoma in Lisbon. Ambassador, welcome. Next to him is Stephen Simon. Mr. Simon is the Robert E. Wilhelm Fellow in International Affairs at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Research Fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He served as the National Security Council Senior Director for Counterterrorism in the Clinton White House and for the Middle East and North Africa in the Obama White House, and in senior positions at the U.S. Department of State. Next to Mr. Simon is Ambassador Kathleen Fitzpatrick. She served for over 38 years as a career diplomat in the U.S. Foreign Service. Her high-level assignments included U.S. Ambassador to the Democratic Republic of Timor-Leste, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Department of State's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, Chief of Staff for the Undersecretary for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights, and Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Ambassador, thank you. And finally, we'd like to welcome Ambassador Faisal Al-Istrabadi. Ambassador Istrabadi is the Michael A. and Laurie Burns McRobbie Professor in Global Strategic Studies and Professor of Central Eurasian Studies in the Indiana University Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies, where he's also the founding director of the Center for the Study of the Middle East. From 2004 to 2010, he represented Iraq at the United Nations, having previously acted as legal advisor to the Iraqi foreign minister during the negotiations for UN Security Council Resolution 1546, which recognized Iraq's reassertion of its sovereignty. Would you help me in welcoming our panelists, please? We have three driving questions for tonight that will help us to frame the conversation. And as Claire mentioned, we invite you to be thinking of your questions as we go through the course of the evening as well. Really, tonight we're looking at what ought to be the U.S.'s role in the world, in this country that's approaching a milestone anniversary. What are the ramifications of that role in this modern world? And if not the U.S., who else could it be? Let's start with the big picture. Ambassador Fitzpatrick, in your experience, why is the U.S. so involved in the world? What motivates the U.S. to be involved around the world?
Matt, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank Ambassador Katz and the American Public Forum. I'd like to thank the International Relations Council and the Truman Presidential Library and all of those who are involved in bringing us here today. It's truly an honor to come here and to speak with you and talk about these essential issues. And Matt, thank you for that question. So the U.S. role in the world, and I think many of you know this so well, really, after World War II, we were the remaining power in the world, and the United States did make a significant effort to strengthen, to rebuild Europe after World War II, and to make sure that the Soviet Union, at the same time, the Soviet Union would not rise to threaten the United States and its allies. So we worked to create the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, where I served in the mid-90s. We worked to establish the UN system, which Ambassador Da Costa knows so well, and Ambassador Faisal and others. And we worked to create even the economic system that we have at the Bretton Woods Conference. All of these things were designed, I think, to make a world, to shape a world in which force, the use of force, wasn't going to be the primary source of international relations, and to make a world where the U.S. and its friends and allies could advance their interests, both political interests and economic interests. That legacy continued after the fall of the Soviet Union, where we worked again with friends and allies to make sure that the countries that were either in the Warsaw Pact or had been annexed by the Soviets many years ago could live their aspirations to become democratic countries and work with the U.S. and friends and allies. Now, I say all this because the United States, and I think we should be very clear, the United States' role in the world is to advance the United States' interest. Not to be selfish about it, but any country's responsibility is to protect its citizens, protect its territory, protect its social and economic interests throughout the world. And for the United States, these are multifaceted and complex. So in today's world, we're going to get into this a little bit more, but there may not be one particular answer or one particular paradigm that we need to approach. I think in our world today, we used to have a framework and a paradigm and a picture, and now we have a jigsaw puzzle of 1,000 pieces, or more, that we all worked on during the height of COVID-19, and we're working on it now without a framework and without a picture. And we're going to have to figure out how those pieces fit together and whether they all fit together in one picture or a different set of pictures. So our role in the world, I think, is because of who we are, because our power in the world, our military power, our economic power, and the political power that we have.
Ambassador, thank you. Steve Simon, let's turn to you for a minute and talk about that grand strategy that Ambassador Fitzpatrick was just mentioning, the sort of drivers or motivators of the U.S. in the world. Has there been consistency over time for the U.S. In why the U.S. would be involved in the world? We know that things shift from administration to administration, but things seem to have become increasingly turbulent in recent years. Is that just a matter of the recency effect, or is that something that we're actually seeing over a longer arc?
Well, it's interesting. People, talk about cognitive bias. These are hardwired tendencies within people, within the human brain, to perceive things in a certain way. And one key cognitive bias is the tendency to see recent things as being much bigger and more important than things that are farther back in time. That cognitive bias, that human hardwired tendency, causes us to think that, well, things have been really different and special in the recent years as compared to before. Whereas the turbulence that you're talking about, it really never, the turbulence began when the Earth's crust cooled. It goes back quite a ways. I think, I'm hesitant to talk about grand strategy because it's, I'm not really sure what it is. And I teach it. So it really makes you wonder. But no, I'm skeptical of it. I do think that the one constant, and this is something I think most of my colleagues would agree with, I think that is the search for security. That's been really the driver of American foreign and security policy. It's the search for security. And the different administrations, given different strategic environments, have perceived threats to the security of the United States in different ways, and that's led to different foreign policies, different approaches to dealing with those threats. But fundamentally, it's a search for security, and that's an insight that's now reshaped, I think, our understanding of the post-war period, where it had been generally believed in the early post-war period during the Cold War that the United States was locked in a struggle with an ideology that in itself was threatening, and that ideology was being advanced by an expansionist power. And then you had the collapse of the Soviet Union, and people looked at American foreign policy and the genesis of it in a different way. At that stage, liberal interventionism came to be seen as the expansionist tendency in the globe, and suddenly the United States was the problem. But now, cooler heads looking back over the post-war period and the post-war period see things differently, and they do see it as in the case of the U.S. and Soviet Union, two countries that were struggling to secure themselves in a very anarchic environment. And I think that continues to define the way in which the United States approaches the world.
Oh, thank you so much. Ambassador Costa, let me turn to you and ask you about the view from Europe. We heard Ambassador Fitzpatrick talking about the Marshall Plan and the rebuilding of Europe. I know that you all visited the Truman Presidential Library today, which focuses significantly on the efforts after World War II. What is the basis, would you say, if you boiled it down? What is the basis of the relationship between Europe and the U.S.? And how does Europe, what is the European view of the U.S.'s role in the world?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to be here tonight. It's a great pleasure for me. Well, when you talk about Europe, we need to be cautious because we talk about, for example, in the European Union, 27 different countries with 27 agendas, which sometimes coincide. That's what we call ourselves a little bit, maybe too much union, but sometimes we divide ourselves. So I used to say that every European country has a different idea about the transatlantic relation. But in the case of my country, which is a small country in Western Europe, it's very curious because we were in a dictatorship until '74, and the only element in our external policy that remained unchanged during the dictatorship and after dictatorship and during democracy times is the transatlantic relation. It's the only factor. No other, we had no relations with European institutions. Africa was a different thing during the colonial days, and even with Latin America, it was a different thing. The transatlantic relation, taking into account the position and the question of Azores and so on during Second World War, created a link which maintains Portugal, and Portugal was maintained during the time since we entered in the European Union. One, I would say the key elements of our strategy in the European Union was the transatlantic relation. And to be frank, United Kingdom was with us the country much more committed to these transatlantic relations inside the European Union. Now we will see with them outside. So when we talk about Europe, it's very difficult to say that we have a certain attitude from Europe towards the European Union, towards the United States. Obviously, there was the position of the United States during First World War and Second World War, the creation of a new international order, which was designed by the United States, and even the unity of Europe was promoted by the United States. And we need to stress that. And even for the creation of NATO, the United States asked the European countries to create the Western European Union in order to be able to make part of this new organization on security in Europe. So I must say that in the last year something happened here in the United States that created in the European Union a certain uneasiness, taking into account that NATO was put into question, and I would say the reliable link that exists with the United States, in a certain moment we lost it. We had the impression that what was taken for granted, the commitment from the United States to the link with Europe, I wouldn't say that disappeared, but at least entering a great question. Curious thing, the current crisis, first of all, proved that the United States are an European power. This is quite clear for me, and that was quite clear in the last months. The United States are an European power, and they have the power to divide Europe, as the United States did in 2003 regarding the question of Iraq, as they have the capacity to unite Europe as they did now. So precisely because they are an European power, they are able to do that. And I must say that at this very moment, we owe a great favor to the United States by the fact that NATO was, I'd say, reinvented a little bit, and we witnessed this evolution of countries like Finland and Sweden, they have in their DNA the neutrality, and in a few days changed and asked for membership of NATO. So it means that the United States were capable to unite Europe. And what we expect from the United States in the future, to answer to the question that you start with, is a leadership of the free world. It's a leadership of the free world, but to be frank, I feel that from the European side, we feel that sometimes the United States consider our interests on their own views. So they take our interests in the perspective of the United States. So we need to have more dialogue between the United States and the European powers in order to define what could be a Western policy.
Ambassador, thank you. And Ambassador Al-Istrabadi, I'll turn to you to ask about the perspective from Iraq, a country that has been through more challenges than many of us can imagine, symbolic of a region that continues to go through significant challenges. There are many models, as the audience well knows, for international engagement, and one of them that I particularly like looks at the 3 Ds of defense, diplomacy, and development for how the U.S. can engage the world. How effective, on balance, would you say the U.S.'s engagement in Iraq was, or in the Middle East more largely, as you care to comment? And how was that balance of, or how is the balance of diplomacy, defense, and development focus?
It is perhaps an apocryphal story that when Chu Enlai was asked his view of who was Mao Zedong's prime minister, more or less, what he thought of the French Revolution, his response was, "It's too soon to know." So I think there is a bit of that. The problem with the United States is that, first of all, from a Middle Eastern perspective, is that the United States is never more than 2 years away from an election. And that turns out to be a real driver. I hesitate to use the word policy, but that turns out to be a real driver of American engagement with, and I say this with personal experience, a real driver of engagement, certainly with Iraq, where decisions were in fact made because of the American political schedule. The other is that, administrations change, policies change, and for very good reasons, Americans have their eyes on the exits. And one of these supposed wise things that wise men and women are supposed to say whenever the United States is contemplating a military action is, what's the exit strategy? And as has been repeated, that's not the way everyone looks at the world. So if the United States is in a contretemps with Iran, while the United States is eyeing the exits in Iraq, Iran is going nowhere. The Taliban used to say, the Americans have watches, we have time. And that's, I don't know if that's apocryphal or not, but it's a real insight in any event. And so that is a real problem in effectuating American policy, it seems to me, throughout the Middle East. And as someone who wished the American project well in Iraq in 2003, it's very frustrating. But no one wakes up in the morning, and I know we haven't quite gotten there yet. No one, I don't think, in the Middle East at least, wakes up in the morning and says, we really want the Chinese model of governance. So that remains the American greatest export. And let me just tell you, I'm a natural-born citizen of the United States as well as Iraq. It's not because I was born twice. It's because of where I was born and to whom I was born. I was born in the United States to Iraqi parents. Only we as Americans can screw up our own governance here, it seems to me, and we're doing a damn fine job of it, I fear. And that is reflected in how Middle Easterners view the United States. So it's a very problematic relationship. And while I agree with my colleague that it's problematic to make too big a deal of what's happening in the headlines at any given time, nevertheless, we live now, we don't live 50 years ago. And we have to deal with what's happening now, here and abroad. And I'm sorry if I've gone on for too long.
No, Ambassador, thank you so much. Steve, Simon, let me come back to you for a second and ask you again about sort of a trajectory or a transition that maybe we've seen over time in unilateral and multilateral approaches to what's going on around the world. It seems like during COVID in particular, there was a significant value to coalitional movement, right? That we were going to work together as a world to solve this problem. And the elephant in the room in this conversation is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Which is forefront for most of us, and the action or inaction that we saw coming out of coalitions as part of that. Can you talk about the U.S.'s view of participating in coalitions and multilateral movements?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, really. Attitudes towards participation in multilateral programs, initiatives, actions have changed over time. So if you look at the immediate post-war period, the UN, 1945, then you have NATO, the Washington Treaty, which brought together key European countries, along with the United States, into a powerful a transatlantic relationship that developed, a very potent institutional base. You had the U.S. pursuing multilateral defensive arrangements outside of Europe, in Southeast Asia, in Central Asia, which didn't work out all that well, and a tendency, which is now dead, to sign mutual defense treaties with countries that had become important to the United States, because the United States always had a tendency in the search for security to keep pushing its security perimeter farther out and farther out and farther out, until, of course, it was global, because the two perimeters, met, and that required alliances, and everyone understood at the time, or there was an understanding at the time, that these alliances were key multipliers of the U.S. ability to exercise influence and, of course, power, influence that stemmed from power. So there was widespread agreement on that. Kathleen mentioned Bretton Woods. There was a whole financial system of banks, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, that all contributed to these things. Okay. The culmination of this approach, I suppose, was the 1991 war against Iraq. And famously so. One day we'll get together and I'll tell you what I really think about all that. But, but to address, the question, George H.W. Bush, who was the president of the United States at the time, famously organized a fabulous coalition, dozens and dozens of countries who signed on to the U.S. The U.S. effort to topple the Iraqi government and disarm it. That was really the high watermark, and it had resonances, really through the Clinton administration, because as we were discussing actually earlier today in another context, the lingering impulse was to carry that forward. And so there was a move to widen NATO, to support the extension of NATO and the moving the security perimeter of the United States via NATO closer to the former Soviet Union. That was not unimportant. There was an effort to pull together a coalition to deal with a crisis in Bosnia, the Bosnian wars. And there, NATO, couldn't be involved directly, but NATO countries got together in an informal alliance to cope with that crisis. But at that point, the multilateral impulse began to wane. The U.S., at least for its part, saw less value in these coalitions. Now, the U.S. still maintained a strong presence in international institutions. The UN is the locus classicus. I mean, that's the really an important focus of American interest. But so there was an interest in multilateral activity, but it wasn't quite what it was. And then the shift, the fundamental shift really took place under the Trump administration, where there was the U.S. actively repudiated the idea of multilateral action. President Trump's notion was that any deal the United States would strike along these lines would essentially be open the door to a ripoff of the United States. And he thought the United States would do better by going it alone. So he pulled out of the transatlantic trade partnership, the Pacific trade partnership. He pulled out of the climate accord. He pulled out of the multilateral deal to stymie Iran's pursuit of a nuclear weapon. He just pulled out of all that, and none of that worked out all that well. When the Biden administration came in, they were determined to restore America's presence in these multilateral institutions. That's what Biden meant when he said, "America is back."
And so, Steve, let me ask Ambassador Fitzpatrick, if I could, when we're dealing with the situation between Russia and Ukraine, based on what Steve just shared, in many ways it seems like a coalition is what would perhaps hold it at bay or somehow make the situation better. Is that, though, what we've seen, right? I think a lot of Americans, as they've watched the news, have said, Ukraine is out there on its own. What can we do to help? We've seen fundraisers around Kansas City. We've seen all sorts of social media campaigns and so on. But what is actually going on to support that? Where do you see that falling in terms of coalition, or they're out there on their own?
Thank you. It's a very interesting question, and I think Steve outlined the history of multilateralism quite well. And I think just in the bigger picture, before I get to specifically Ukraine, in my own personal view, we should see multilateralism or working with other countries as a tool of our diplomacy when it's appropriate, when it's an appropriate tool, and that we can work to achieve our goals in a cost-beneficial way with the least amount of spillage of blood and treasure. And so I think that's a sort of a realistic, pragmatic, but slightly idealistic way of looking at multilateralism. And I can't help myself but be an idealist after 38 years in the U.S. State Department. But I think it should be seen, if we could, seen as a tool, just like at times acting on our own could be a tool. Ukraine is a very interesting discussion because I think there is a multilateral effort to support Ukraine in supplying military supplies and arms and equipment. We are constrained, as we know, by the idea that further escalation, direct involvement by NATO, direct involvement by the US militarily, could escalate this conflict into something that we cannot control. Could it escalate into use of weapons that long we have not used ever since the end of World War II on the Russian side. So I think that what has happened in Ukraine, and I think, and Ambassador, you're in Europe, you might have a better view, and from the Middle East, is that people have seen that what we're specifically dealing with in Putin as a leader is something quite different than what we have seen even before in the Soviet Union or in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. And there is a requirement, I think, to be able to help support Ukraine fight off the invasion for a number of reasons. One is to, make sure that we are making clear to anyone who would try to change the borders of countries that there are some consequences. This is an area of stability that I think is extremely important to the United States and to its allies. So there is multilateralism. There's different ways of doing multilateralism. Sometimes it's the coalition of the willing engaging militarily. Sometimes it's the NATO alliance and others working collectively in a more indirect way to try to achieve our goals. My personal view is that in many cases, when we look at the challenges that we face, we must work with other countries. It's in order to achieve our own goals, and that we work better together when we're with other countries. But in Ukraine, I think right now we're witnessing the challenges that we face, not only to the NATO alliance, but to the world, given the reaction to Putin's actions in Ukraine.
Ambassador, thank you. And Ambassador DaCosta, let me turn to you for the European perspective, the NATO perspective on what's going on there, and who is setting the tone about the NATO response to Ukraine. I think there were a lot of people that after they caught their breath at what had happened, I mean, it was an unprecedented attack, an unprecedented invasion that I think some people anticipated could be a possibility. I don't know how many people saw it as a probability that it would come to pass. But once they saw that, I think they were interested in what the response would be. We've seen the emergence of some really dynamic leaders on the European continent in the last number of years. Angela Merkel comes to mind. Emmanuel Macron has stepped up in a number of ways. Who is setting the tone between the U.S. and Europe right now in terms of the response to the situation in Ukraine?
If you allow me, I would like to start by commenting something that was said regarding multilateralism in the United States. You just mentioned one of the aspects which is seen from the European side as a negative aspect of a negative attitude from the United States. It's this kind of multilateralism à la carte. Let's say the United States use multilateralism when it is useful, and sometimes it would put aside and decides to go alone. And precisely because the multilateral world was, I would say, a culture that the United States more or less introduced it in the world, and particularly after the Second World War, created as a sort of a model of functioning, and it survived during the Cold War. It's a bit surprising for American friends, for those who are normally with America, that sometimes the United States decide to go alone. And sometimes they use it, which creates an idea of a sort of an opportunistic way to look to the international system. Let's be frank totally about that, because this is one of the attitudes from the United States that sometimes are seen by the allies as being a little bit incoherent with the global perspective. In what concerns with NATO, I remember that it was Macron that said NATO is cerebral, it's in death, more or less it died 2 years ago. In reality, NATO was shaken by Trump's attitude, and NATO was at question. So the idea was NATO has conditions to be maintained like that, with so many reticences from the United States. And the United States, let's be frank, the United States, it's NATO. 90% of NATO is the United States. The other countries obviously are important. We have two nuclear powers in NATO, but let's be frank, the cement and the great strength comes from the United States. The moment the United States start putting questions, one could say, okay, Europe decided to go on their own and create a certain an alternative structure in security and defense. It's impossible for Europe to create that strength. Even now that we are more or less united by the shock which was provoked in our public opinions and different governments by the invasion of Ukraine. Even now, to be frank, and having known the European Union for a long time, I was Minister for European Affairs in the Portuguese government, and I felt all this impact, particularly the impact of the enlargement of the European Union and the enlargement of NATO. I don't feel, to be frank, that we have conditions in the European Union to create an alternative, let's say, an European security and defense system. Even now that we have Germany changing 100% their position, that we have, as I said, Finland and Sweden inside the NATO. Even now, it is very difficult to sustain a common position in various areas. We are a very different continent. We have different neighbors. If you look to the attitude of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland towards Russia, or if you look to the attitude from some countries which are in the other side, maybe at this very moment we are together, but sooner or later, people will react on the basis of their main concerns. And I remember one day that a few years ago that I went to Estonia with a Portuguese foundation discussing our priorities in the European Union what are our 5 priorities. And the Estonian guy said, my first priority is Russia, second Russia, third Russia. So we start talking about the others afterwards. Well, you can imagine if you ask the Portuguese representative 2 years ago, it was not like that. So things, we are different and we project a different perspective. Now we are together. For how long, I don't know, to be frank.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And you know, you talked about sort of the controversial nature of multilateralism when it suits the United States. Another criticism of the U.S.'s involvement around the world, Ambassador, has been the U.S.'s focus on what is called democracy building. Right, this notion that the U.S. will go into a place that doesn't have a functional democracy, doesn't have a Western-style democracy, and will plant something that resembles what goes on in the Western world. What is the view of people that you know in the Middle East of the U.S.'s pursuit of democracy building?
First, it's interesting, if I may just comment on the colloquy between two of my colleagues. It's interesting that, Ambassador, you criticized the sort of American position, which really is the American position, that it uses multilateralism when it suits it and not when it doesn't. It's not really altogether that dissimilar from what you described of the European states. Right now, you're united because there is a real threat to Europe. But sooner or later, the European states are going to begin to consider their own, if I may, with respect, say, more parochial, or maybe more, parochial perhaps sounds negative, more national interests, as opposed to European interests. It's not dissimilar. It's a very similar kind of process, and this is what countries do. As far as the American promotion of democracy, I guess it's a liberal theory that democracies don't fight one another, and that therefore the promotion of democracy is, in the long run, it tends the world towards peace. And of course, realists point out that the problem with liberals is they tend to want to fight, messianic wars, I think is the expression. I'm not a political scientist, I'm a lawyer, but I think that's the expression, messianic wars for democracy, and who knows who's right and who's wrong. The Brits tried to install a system that was modeled on the Westminster model in various Middle Eastern states at the end of the First World War, and the Americans have tried, at least in Iraq. It's once again, it goes back to what I said before. The U.S. has always got its eyes on the exits, and it turns out, it seems to me, when I think the European Union won the Nobel Prize, the Peace Prize at one point, and Sir Malcolm Rifkind, who was I think he was one of Margaret Thatcher's foreign secretaries for a time, was still a member of Parliament, was still a member of the House of Commons when the European Union won the Nobel Prize. And he gave a speech on the floor of the House, on the floor of the Commons, in which he said that the prize should have been split with NATO. And that's a really interesting point, because if one is going to congratulate oneself for European democracy, and let's recall that some European states now are very fragile democracies, perhaps failing democracies. Hungary. Poland comes and goes, depending on what issue you look at. Other states had no particular concept of Western democracy. That phrase you use stuck in my craw a bit. Germany, Italy. So if there's an American success story in Europe, Greece for that matter, if there's an American success story in cultivating democracy, if that's what it is, if it's an American success story, I'm not saying that it is, it's one of engagement for 8 decades. And the US just doesn't have the staying power to pull that off in the Middle East. It just doesn't. Not all of my former colleagues in Baghdad realize that. But no one talks about Iraq much in Washington anymore. I would also like to, by the way, address one other thing, and that is about the American perception. Steve just said that Bush, it was a high watermark, George Herbert Walker Bush, and in a certain way it absolutely was, in terms of a subject that is very near and dear to my heart, the United Nations, and getting an international coalition and the authorization of the Security Council for the use of force and all of that absolutely was a high watermark. People forget. George H.W. Bush also exhorted the people of Iraq to rebel against Saddam Hussein. He told them in February or January rather, of after the war had started in 1991. And I'm almost quoting, another way for this war to end is for the people of Iraq to take things into their own hands. They took that very seriously, the Iraqis. They did rebel against Saddam Hussein. And 14 of Iraq's 18 governorates came under rebel control until General Schwarzkopf gave Saddam's army permission to fly helicopter gunships in Iraq, and they massacred the rebels. The Iraqis never forgot that, and they never forgave the United States for that. So when the US went back in 2003, expecting sweets and flowers, that scenario was 1991. When the ground war began, there was euphoria in Baghdad. The Iraqis were in no mood to welcome the Americans in 2003. In this room, 1991 is ancient history. Not if you had your family wiped out by Saddam Hussein. And Americans never remember that.
Ambassador, thank you. I want to make sure we get some questions from the audience. And our roving reporter, Stephen Steigman, is here looking for a microphone.
Certainly. Yep.
Why, thank
We'll
you.
bring some questions in from the audience. Thank you.
And again, if you do have a question and haven't had a chance to hand it in, please do so. As you might expect, some questions all over the board, including one that I'll kind of now read as a rhetorical question in response, not response, but to echo something that was being stated just recently. Should state ideology influence relationships, and should America support democracies simply because they're democracies? But let me get to a question here from Mark in Leavenworth, who asks, what are the prospects for arms control as an element of U.S. policy? What role does U.S. policy continue to play in arms control?
Ambassador Fitzpatrick, would you care to take that one?
Oh, thank you very much. Not being an expert on arms control, but having seen our arms control policies develop over the years, particularly, I would say, during the Cold War, where our arms control policies with the Soviets actually effectively prevented a misunderstanding and nuclear conflagration. Arms control in the current world, and there are various mechanisms for arms control, but right now it's extremely difficult. I think it would be useful, but how do you develop a comprehensive or even a regional arms control program without being able to control the sources and the trafficking in arms, actually, and now we're dealing with technology where people can, with the printing, of actual weaponry, and on the internet, people have access to all kinds of information and all kinds of means of controlling arms, and then I guess we get into these issues of, well, who decides, and what are the mechanisms, and what are the disincentives if you're in an arms control multilateral either a treaty or understanding. What are the incentives for countries to abide by that, and who enforces it? So I think it's a very good question and a very complex question. I don't have a specific actual answer for it. I think it gets to the fact that we're in a new situation these days, a different world, where some of these things that we relied on in our distant past are things we're thinking about now probably, but wondering, how do we execute this? Who leads it, and how is it led, and how is it implemented?
Here's another question that I think a lot of us are thinking, and I'm guessing that you may have a different perspective on this than many people either here in the audience or many people in the United States. The question here from Timmy is, why is Russia's invasion of Ukraine getting so much more attention than, let's say, the Ethiopian civil war or Yemen's humanitarian crisis?
Steve Simon, in your experience, why do things fall out of the news cycle?
It's very sad. Wars in Europe, they kind of get the attention of the United States because I don't want to be too cautious in answering this question, but let's just say that in the United States there are very thick, what the political scientist Joe Nye called very thick relations with Europe. And in his book, where he discusses this, he has really interesting statistics drawn from census survey results over time. And it turns out that more Americans claim European ancestry than could actually be the case given the number of Americans who were surveyed. Okay, it's just so people imagine themselves as having originated in Europe, the cradle of, dare I say, white civilization. So So that's one reason. A related reason is that the U.S. has been so intensively and intensely involved in European security since 1918. Well, 1917, I suppose, was when the United States declared war on Germany. So, and where the U.S. saw its interests as served by stabilizing Europe. That the stability of Europe was viewed as essential to American security. Now, the United States was looking at the Pacific in a kind of a similar way. In 1910, the Navy was already developing war plans against Japan, and because it was just assumed that at some point the U.S. and the Japanese would clash over supremacy in the Pacific. But in Europe, it was really deep. It was really deep. And then, World War II kind of sealed the deal. And then you had these episodes that my colleagues here have described, quite well, the Marshall Plan and NATO and so forth. And, the U.S., this tendency to see the U.S. as having American origins, as having European origins, and therefore umbilically linked to the European continent, meshed and reinforced, meshed with and reinforced these security ties that we developed. So when you ask, why did the wars in Bosnia or why did the war in Ukraine attract so much attention? Well, I'd have to say, are you kidding? Of course they would, much more so than crises elsewhere. An intervention in crises, is not cost-free. So, Americans, when they do intervene, in a war, they're going to ask themselves, is it worth the cost? And in Europe, the answer seems to be sort of automatic, which is yes, it's worth it.
And so on that note, Ambassador DaCosta, let me ask you, if U.S. eyes are trained on Europe, as Steve was just sharing, we know that U.S. Americans do not vote in large part on foreign policy issues, right? They vote on pocketbook issues and other things that are more tangible and closer at hand. And so U.S. Americans' awareness of what's going on around the world is not terribly strong for the most part, right? I think we can all agree on that. And that's why we're here in Kansas City as the International Relations Council. Our mission is to strengthen Kansas City's global perspective because these things do matter. But U.S. tax dollars pay for more defense than the next 9 countries combined, right? We have significant financial and personal investment in things that are going on around the world. But if you look at places like countries in Europe, for example, the awareness of Europeans, on average, about what's happening in the United States is remarkably high, right? If you talk to people in almost any country, Ambassador, I would imagine in Iraq and other parts of the Middle East, there's a greater awareness of what's going on in the U.S. What accounts for that, in your opinion?
Well, sometimes we would like to vote here. I must tell you. But the importance of the presence of the attitude in the United States regarding the question of Europe, we need to stress one thing. The United States are a member of NATO. It's a key member of NATO. It was the NATO borders which were more or less under threat with the Russian invasion. It's obviously it was Ukraine, which is not a NATO member, but the sensitivity for the Baltic countries, for Poland, for Romania, for Slovakia, regarding this attitude and this aggression. So it is only natural that the United States be on this side, and in particular, it is natural that taking into account that Russia inherited a little bit of Soviet Union, now we realize that inherited a lot from Soviet Union, and And it was, even if China became the great concern of the United States in the last years, obviously Russia was, let's say, not an enemy, but at least a threat, a reasonable threat in different areas, namely in these neighboring areas of NATO. So it is only natural that the United States take a particular attention on that. And there is another point. It's the European countries, the majority of European countries and the European Union as such as an institution, we share more or less the same principles and values that the United States have. So we are, let's say, brothers on this projection of liberal democracy, even if some European countries now go in a discutable direction. But in terms of the values that we promote, we are more or less in same boat. So it is only natural that this kind of attitude takes impact on the United States. On Europe, we, as I said, as European Union, as the United States are an European power, and we realize that the United States are able to mobilize or to unite or to separate the Europe, it is only natural that the political evolution in the United States, it's not indifferent to us. So I must say that when the elections take place in the United States, we look very carefully, and as I said, we'd like to vote because sometimes we have a strong opinion about who should win, because we know that the decision which is taken here in the United States will have a real impact in our lives in Europe.
Ambassador, let me ask you, in the Middle East writ large, in the lives of Middle Easterners, is there a clear demarcation? So Ambassador DaCosta several times has mentioned that the U.S. is a European power, which is an interesting way of framing it. Is there a line of demarcation for Middle Eastern governments and Middle Eastern average citizens between Europe and the United States? Or is it just seen as this block of Western forces or Western influences? As you mentioned, Britain had a significant role in drawing borders in the Middle East after World War I. And the United States obviously had an important role in setting the world order after World War II. Is there a clear demarcation?
Well, you keep saying that the United States is a European power, and of course you're absolutely right about that, but of course it's also an Asian power, it's a Middle Eastern power. If it wants to play the role, it could be an African power. It just generally tends to ignore Africa. Even though there is an Africa command now, which historically there wasn't. But generally I think in the Middle East, which is not known as an exemplar of democratic norms, you have to make a distinction between elites and the large mass of the populations. And let me here speak of Israel is a sort of a special case. Let me exempt Israel from my remarks. Let me talk about the Arab Middle East and Iran and Turkey, which of course are not Arab countries, although they are obviously predominantly Muslim. So you have to distinguish, I think, between the elites and the mass populations. From the mass population level, with all respect to our European colleague, Europe is seen, I think, largely these days, since the Pax Americana after the Second World War, as sort of a subordinate player to the United States, almost as satellites of the United States, which is not a fair assessment, but nonetheless, I think, is widely held in the Middle East. Elites understand that that's not necessarily true. We don't have time for me to tell war stories, but when I was at the United Nations, I did understand that on the Security Council, on certain issues, I succeeded, for instance, in driving a wedge between the French on the one hand and the English and the UK and the US on the other for the benefit of a policy that I was instructed to pursue for Iraq. And so you can do that. But I don't think that's the mass perception of Europe vis-à-vis the United States.
Ambassador, thank you. Ambassador Fitzpatrick, let me ask you a quick question, and then I do want to get back to Stephen to see if we have any final questions we can fit into our time together. The time goes fast, doesn't it, everybody? Ambassador Fitzpatrick, you were ambassador to Timor-Leste, which is an emerging democracy in Oceania, which is an incredible case of I think a number of things, but especially spheres of influence is what I'm trying to get to. One name that we haven't really mentioned during our conversation today, and we would be remiss if we didn't, is China. China is conducting what they call the Belt and Road Initiative. As many of you know, they are creating infrastructure projects and cultural projects and all sorts of influential work in a number of countries and continents around the world. I'm curious, when Timor-Leste emerged as a new democracy and it's in its process of getting its wings, where is it looking right now? How much of an influence does China have versus the U.S.?
First of all, let me talk about where Timor-Leste is located in the world. It is sort of at the very end of the archipelago of partly Indonesia and partly Timor-Leste, about an hour flight north of Australia, northern Australia. So it is in Southeast Asia and a very interesting and important region to the United States. You mentioned about democracy. Well, this country is a country that perhaps did benefit from multilateralism, from the work of the United Nations, which was key, I think, to its inception as a nation when there was a referendum taken in 1999 where the people decided they would like to be independent and not part of Indonesia, which had invaded. And there was a violent reaction to that on the part of the then government in Jakarta, but the United Nations supported that referendum. The United States actually also supported the referendum, and of course many other countries in the world. And the UN played a huge role in helping stabilize the country and helping to fulfill that country's wishes to become a stable and democratic state. The United States did as well, Australia and other countries, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, and others. So it's a very interesting example, and Ambassador Da Costa knows this country very, very well. So I would say that that country is partly a question, but it's what you're getting at is a bigger question of the U.S. role, perhaps, in Asia. And apart from Timor-Leste, I'll put that in a different category, but we are a European power, but we also obviously are a Pacific power by dint of our geography and our history since World War II. You're talking about China. China is a country that we have a huge trade and economic relationship with China, which demands a kind of strong relationship with China, but at the same time, there are elements of Chinese policies, both internally and externally, that compete with some of the interests and values of the United States. So we have to find a way to work with that, and to make sure that our interests and those of our allies in Asia, of which we have a number of treaty allies, are protected, and working with those allies. I think we're much more effective, getting back to multilateralism, we are much more effective when we do work with friends and allies on common goals. We were able to be a force multiplier. In some cases, we might be the lead country. In other cases, it might be a country in that specific region that takes the lead. We are now in the situation where we are seeing China really emerge as a hugely powerful country, and by dint of its population and its economic power. And it's a challenge to the United States, but perhaps it's an opportunity as well to try to see how we can develop a pragmatic relationship with a strong competitive power.
Thank you so much. One more, Stephen, please.
Yeah, I'd love to stick with China for just a moment. This question from somebody here in the audience. Though the U.S. one-China policy treats Taiwan in a much different way than the U.S. treats Ukraine. One's status is ambiguous. The other is a recognized independent and sovereign nation. What does this difference in treatment and the U.S. and multinational response to the Russian invasion mean for deterring China from forcible unification with Taiwan?
Steve Simon, have you seen parallels between those two situations?
Well, others draw connections. So, for example, one of the reasons that advocates of strong U.S. support for Ukraine and the military defeat of Russia, one of the reasons that they advance for this is that it will discourage China from attempting to take over Taiwan. So the backing that the West is giving Ukraine is crucial for East Asian security. And that's, the argument they make. I don't find it particularly credible. And maybe I'll invite, my co-panelists to weigh in on this. I think it's kind of desperate rationale, in a way, for pushing this war in Ukraine to lengths that might prove dangerous and be very costly. It's already quite costly for Europe, not so much for the United States, even though we're spending a lot of money. But anyway, it's a fragile situation. But advocates look to the effort in Taiwan as a way to deter China from going into Taiwan, because China must now fear severe sanctions and a strong military response by Taiwan that might make Chinese success highly doubtful. I'm not really too, sure about that either. But that's the argument. That's how people connect these two things. The Taiwan question, I think has to be viewed independently. The Chinese have said that they're going to take it back and absorb it, and at some point, they undoubtedly will, or it seems quite likely. In the United States, it's a hot button domestic political issue. And standing up for Taiwanese independence, regardless of the formal U.S. commitment to the One China policy, is seen as a litmus test for any American administration claiming to be a strong defender of America, its allies, and democracy, and so forth. Because Taiwan, after all, is a thriving democracy. And Taiwanese do see themselves as being a separate country. They don't see themselves as being part of the PRC, and that resonates with advocates in the United States of defending Taiwanese independence. This could bring the United States and China into conflict, regardless of what happens in Europe between, Russia and Ukraine, and the U.S. and NATO country support, for Ukraine in that conflict.
Thank you so much. We're coming to the end of our time, and I want to make sure we have a chance for our final set of questions, which is an APS tradition to ask the panelists, so what and now what? And what I would do is just remind us of sort of where we started. We wanted to look in this conversation at what is the U.S.'s role in the world? What are the ramifications of that role? And who else could it be? So as you're leaving this conversation today, what are the key points you say that our audience should take with them? And I won't call on anyone for this. I'll let you self-identify as you'd like to share. Ambassador DaCosta, go ahead, please. Thank you.
So, where we go from here, particularly in current days? Well, I think that we expect from the United States, as I said in the beginning, some kind of leadership in terms of defining a little bit the freedom that these like-minded countries share. But we don't expect from the United States to create or to recreate, and the so-called summit of democracies try to recreate that, a sort of division between those who are democracies and those who are not democracies. I was ambassador to the United Nations in New York, and most of the countries that were members of the United Nations were not democracies in what we could define as pure democracies. And this is the logic of the international community. The international community lives with different types of regimes and different types of internal organization of states. And this is the order that was created after the Second World War. And it is shocking to say that, but there is not a hierarchy in terms of the democracies are above the dictatorships. In international order, they have exactly the same right in terms of international law. So I think we need to live with them. We need to live with them. You are putting the question regarding the arms control. We cannot have a debate about arms control in order to recreate some kind of agreement in an international agreement without talking with countries which are precisely in our opposite side. So let's be frank, we need to live with the others, with those which are completely in the other side. It's the only way to have peace.
Thank you. Mr. Simon, please go ahead.
Thank you. You can't have a coherent foreign policy if your domestic politics are in disarray. And American politics are seriously broken now, and that's going to complicate the ability of the United States to influence events abroad. That's number one. Number two, the Congress is in the process of authorizing an $850 billion defense budget. And that doesn't include overseas contingency accounts, which, I mean, that number will grow. Let's just stipulate that. That is an awesome amount of money, which is detached from the strategic environment the United States actually occupies, in which we're trying to operate. Worse, it disregards the really important issues that we need to be dealing with, which are climate, pandemic forecasting and response, and at home, doing something about the maldistribution of wealth in the United States, which has created tremendous tensions, political tensions in our country. And $850 billion would go a long way towards dealing with, I think, some of those issues. So, my parting shot is we need to get our house in order, and then worry about, overseas challenges.
Thanks so much, Ambassador.
Thank you. I think it really is important to have our house in order, and that answers all of this answers the so what. It's so important, all of these issues, and getting it right for the security of the United States and its friends and allies, which are also vital to, in the end, to our security. And so I think one answer to what now, it's hard. It's really hard right now, I think. And that's not a good answer. It's not a good policy-making answer. But right now, that jigsaw puzzle that I was talking about, we don't even know what the picture is that we're trying to put together. And do we need to know? I think that we need to have some idea of where we're trying to go. I think we need to think about unintended consequences. There are the unintended consequences always, anytime any country uses force. And often that tends to be our first resort when there are crises, and we see the reverberations of unintended consequences of the use of force that we need to be thinking about in a strategic sense. Secondly, even the unintended consequences of some of our other policies. We talked about democracy support. In some instances, that really makes a huge difference in the countries involved. And then in other instances, there are unintended consequences of raising the hopes of people that we aren't able to fulfill. So I think that it's extremely difficult. I think we have to remember that many of these issues are dependent on not only U.S. politics, but the view of the American public. For example, human rights, that's something that's mandated by Congress. You know, the creation of a bureau in the State Department to protect human rights was mandated by Congress and followed by Congress, followed very closely. It's bipartisan, and some other aspects of our related policy. So I think, you know, we're in a complex situation. We have to figure out how to do strategy while at the same time managing our political situation, getting our house in order, and thinking through all the unintended consequences. So it's not going to be easy, but I think with some students today asked us what advice we would give them, and many of us said, look, we don't have all the answers, but it's so important for you to be engaged and for you to think and read and study and think and not retreat, because it is pretty easy right now, given the challenges that we face. But one last thing is we've faced many, many challenges in our history. And hopefully this will be one that we'll be able to figure out and face as we have in the past. That's the idealistic part of my realistic, pragmatist approach to the world. Thank you.
That's your last word.
Well, it seems to me, is it Rabbi Hillel who said, if not us, who? And I guess the rest of it is, if not now, when? The only time the United States gets criticized, it seems to me, more for acting in the world is when it fails to act in the world. When there's some crisis somewhere, be it humanitarian or otherwise, or man-made. I'm sorry, those two are not in distinction with one another. Be it a natural disaster or a man-made disaster. If the U.S. doesn't respond, it's criticized for not responding. When it does respond, it's also criticized. To me, that means it's still the indispensable nation. Now, I don't know if we need an $850 billion defense budget, but the world's not going to police itself. Somebody has to do it. And for 80 years almost, it's been the United States. When the British withdrew, they could take comfort in when the British withdrew from their mastery of global affairs, mastery over global affairs. They could take comfort in the fact that their closest ally and ideological fellow traveler, the United States, was the rising power. That's not going to be the case if the U.S. falls in on itself. And so the question is, and I loved what you talked about in terms of unintended consequences. What's the world, you know, we leave our children, our grandchildren. I know that's a very cheap thing to say, but it's actually true. And for all the, I said it in my first set of remarks here this evening, no one looks to China and says, that's the governing model we want here. There are many reasons why people align themselves with China, but that's not one of them. And indeed, when we dissipate that model so that democracy looks nothing more than chaos, we are hurting ourselves as an example around the world, and also it hurts the ability of the United States to attract allies, to attract fellow travelers. My money is still on the United States. My view is that unless we implode, unless we cause our politics to continue to splinter us, for the reason I have continued to articulate, I still think this is going to be an American century. For the sake of my children and hopefully one day grandchildren who will live in this country, even though my father's family at least have been in Iraq for 7 centuries, that line has been cut permanently. For their sake, I hope I'm right about that.
It has been an honor and a privilege for me to share this stage with you. Thank you all so much for your time and your dedication this evening. And it's now my pleasure to hand it over to Lauren from American Public Square. Thank you.
Thank you so much. While we don't encourage applause during the program, I do hope you will join me in a collective round of applause for our moderator, our esteemed panelists, our roving reporter, our fact checker. We had light work for you tonight, but we appreciate your work nonetheless. Our partner in tonight's program, the International Relations Council, and all of our sponsors who made this evening possible. Will you join me in thanking them? I also would be remiss if I didn't thank our members in the room. We know you have a choice in how you spend your time and your resources, and we are beyond honored that you chose to spend it tonight with us. If you are not yet a member, if you didn't raise your hand earlier, but you are leaving tonight inspired, curious, or maybe even a little challenged, then I invite you to join the APS family. Visit AmericanPublicSquare.org, and we will look forward to welcoming you at future programs. As a small perk for joining this evening, I have 2 incentives for you. One, if you join this evening, we're not just going to give you a membership for yourself. We believe the best things in life are shared, and so we're going to give you a complimentary membership to share with a friend, colleague, or family member. Additionally, if you join this evening, you will be entered into a drawing for a complimentary ticket to our annual fundraiser, Evening at the Square. This year, we're going to be hosting it on Tuesday, November 29th at the National World War I Museum and Memorial, and our featured guest will be Robert Costa of CBS News. So we would love to see you there. Next Wednesday, if you are getting into the holiday shopping spirit and you are and you also want to support American Public Square, I invite you to join us at 10,000 Villages in downtown Overland Park for a shopping event and celebration of you. Thursday. Let's try that again. Wednesday, the 21st, from 5 to 7 p.m. We hope to see you there. Lastly, you're going to receive a post-event survey, and we implore you to fill that out. And if you were inspired by the civility of tonight's conversation and you want to model that, say, at your Thanksgiving dinner table, I invite you to pick up a copy of our civility rules on your way out. It will help you moderate a discussion around that Thanksgiving table, and we want to provide this to you, so please take one for yourself, take one to share. And again, on behalf of our founder, Alan Katz, our executive director, Claire Bishop, and the entire American Public Square team, I want to thank you for coming tonight. We look forward to seeing you again, but until then, be well and be civil. Thanks.